You'll see some AI-generated images in this documentary, mostly to help visualize events we don't have footage for, and sometimes just for a bit of humor. But we also work hard to show real historical photos and primary sources whenever we can, because we don't want to misrepresent or distort the past. AI visuals are there to illustrate the story, not rewrite it. When Americans talk about the Constitution, we usually talk about it like it descended from the heavens on a beam of patriotic light. There it is, the Constitution, sacred parchment, holy text of the Republic. Smells faintly of liberty, powdered wigs, and whatever James Madison used for hair product. But in 1787 and 1788, not everyone looked at the Constitution and saw salvation. Some Americans looked at it and saw danger. They saw a powerful central government. They saw distant elites. They saw federal courts that could overrule local authority. They saw national taxation. They saw a president who looked suspiciously like a king wearing Republican makeup. They saw the possibility of a standing army. And they saw a new government that might begin with promises of liberty, then slowly gather power until the people were left asking, "Wait, didn't we just fight a revolution over this?" These critics became known as the Anti-Federalists, and they lost. The Constitution was ratified. The new federal government took shape. George Washington became president. The United States moved forward under the system we still live under today. But here's the question. Were the Anti-Federalists just paranoid obstructionists standing in the way of progress? Or were they warning America about problems that would never really go away? Today on Historical History, we're asking, were the Anti-Federalists right all along? And if you like videos about early American politics, constitutional fights, and old men yelling at parchment, be sure to subscribe. Now let's get into the founding debate America never really stopped having. Before we can understand the Anti-Federalists, we need to remember what came before the Constitution: the Articles of Confederation. The Articles were America's first attempt at national government after independence, and they were designed with one very clear goal: do not create another powerful central authority. Which makes sense. The American Revolution had been fought against a king and parliament that colonists believed had overreached, overtaxed, overcommanded, and over-everythinged. So when Americans created their first national government, they made it intentionally weak. Congress could request money from the states, but it could not force them to pay. It could make decisions, but had no executive branch to enforce them. It had no national judiciary to settle disputes. It could not effectively regulate trade between the states. It could not easily amend the Articles without unanimous agreement. And unanimous agreement among 13 states is exactly as easy as getting 13 toddlers to agree on one bedtime story. The result was a government that could barely function. The national government was broke. States ignored federal requests. Trade disputes broke out. Foreign countries doubted whether the United States was even a serious nation or just 13 cousins arguing in a barn. Then came Shays' Rebellion in 1786 and 1787. Farmers in Massachusetts, many of them Revolutionary War veterans, rose up against taxes, debt, and court actions that threatened their farms. The rebellion terrified national leaders because it exposed a brutal truth. The Confederation government could not effectively respond to internal unrest. To men like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and George Washington, the lesson was obvious. The Articles had failed. America needed a stronger national government. And honestly, they had a point. A country that cannot tax, enforce laws, regulate trade, pay debts, or defend itself is not really a country. It is more like a group project where everyone says, "Yeah, I'll totally do my part." And then one person ends up making the entire PowerPoint at midnight. So in 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia to revise the Articles. Except they did not revise them. They threw them in the political trash and created a whole new constitution. And that is when the Anti-Federalists entered the chat. The Constitution created a much stronger federal government. It had a president, a Congress with real lawmaking authority, a federal court system, the power to tax, the power to regulate interstate and foreign commerce, the power to raise armies, the power to make federal law supreme over state law. To the Federalists, this was necessary. To the Anti-Federalists, this looked like the beginning of a slow-motion disaster. Now, the name Anti-Federalist is a little misleading. It makes them sound like they were anti-government cave goblins squatting in the woods, hissing at constitutions. But most Anti-Federalists were not against union. They were not necessarily against having a national government. They were against what they called consolidation. In other words, they feared the Constitution would slowly transform the United States from a federation of states into one centralized national government. They wanted power to remain close to the people, mostly in the states and local communities. Their argument was not, "Let's have no government." Their argument was, maybe don't create a government powerful enough to crush us while smiling and calling it liberty. Which, fair enough. That is at least worth a meeting. The Anti-Federalists were not one unified party. They were a loose coalition. Some were elite politicians. Some were farmers. Some were debtors. Some were state leaders afraid of losing power. Some were genuine civil libertarians. Some were suspicious of aristocracy. Some were just very committed to ruining James Madison's week. Among them were figures like Patrick Henry, George Mason, Elbridge Gerry, Mercy Otis Warren, and anonymous essayists writing under names like Brutus, Cato, Sentinel, and Federal Farmer. They wrote essays, gave speeches, debated ratification, and warned that the Constitution had dangerous flaws. And their first major complaint was simple: where are the rights? The original Constitution did not include a Bill of Rights. That is one of those facts that still feels weird. Today, Americans treat the Bill of Rights as central to the Constitution. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, protection from unreasonable searches, trial by jury, protection against cruel and unusual punishment. These are not minor details. These are the parts people quote when they are mad at the government, mad at police, mad at Congress, mad at school boards, mad at social media, or mad that someone told them they cannot bring a live raccoon into a courthouse. But the Constitution, as originally written, did not have them. Federalists argued that a Bill of Rights was unnecessary because the federal government only had the powers specifically granted to it. If the Constitution did not give Congress power to censor speech, then why list freedom of speech? Anti-Federalists did not find this comforting. Their response was basically, "That's adorable. Put it in writing." They believed rights needed to be explicitly protected because vague assumptions were not enough. A powerful government would always find ways to stretch its authority. George Mason refused to sign the Constitution, in part because it lacked a Declaration of Rights. Patrick Henry attacked the Constitution in the Virginia Ratifying Convention. Anti-Federalist writers warned that without clear protections, liberty would depend on trust, and they did not trust. Honestly, their trust levels were somewhere between locked diary and man guarding his sandwich from seagulls. This pressure worked. Several states ratified the Constitution while recommending amendments. James Madison, who had initially doubted the need for a Bill of Rights, eventually became one of its main architects in Congress. In 1791, the Bill of Rights was ratified. And this is where the Anti-Federalists scored their greatest victory. They lost the Constitution fight, but they forced the new government to add the amendments that became some of the most important protections in American history. So, if you enjoy freedom of speech, freedom of religion, trial by jury, protections against unreasonable searches, or the ability to yell, "I know my rights," even when you absolutely do not know your rights, you can thank the Anti-Federalists, at least partly. The Anti-Federalists' deepest fear was that the Constitution would consolidate power at the national level. They looked at clauses like the Supremacy Clause, which made federal law supreme over state law, and the Necessary and Proper Clause, which gave Congress power to pass laws needed to carry out its constitutional duties. To Federalists, these were practical tools. To Anti-Federalists, they were giant red flags. They worried that Congress would use broad language to expand its power over time. They feared that state governments would gradually become secondary. They argued that a free republic needed power to remain close to the people. A small republic, they believed, allowed citizens to know their representatives. Local officials were visible. State governments were accessible. If leaders abused power, the people could respond. But a large national republic? That was different. A distant government could become detached. Representatives might not understand local needs. Power would gather in the hands of men far removed from ordinary life. And that concern did not exactly disappear. More than 200 years later, Americans still complain about Washington, D.C. being distant, unresponsive, corrupt, bureaucratic, and controlled by elites. So yes, the Anti-Federalists may have lost ratification, but their ghost has been sitting in the passenger seat of American politics ever since, whispering, "Told you this would get weird." Another anti-federalist concern was representation. The House of Representatives, they argued, would be too small to truly represent the people. Representatives would come from the educated, wealthy, and well-connected classes. Ordinary farmers, laborers, and local citizens would have little real influence. This connects directly to the larger founding debate over democracy. Many Federalists feared too much democracy. They worried that popular passions could destroy stability, property rights, and order. Anti-Federalists feared too little accountability. They believed government should be close enough to the people that rulers could not drift into aristocracy. And the word aristocracy came up a lot. To Anti-Federalists, the Constitution created conditions for a new ruling class. Wealthy representatives, powerful senators, federal judges with lifetime appointments, and a president with enormous authority. No crowns, no robes, no official nobility, just powerful men making decisions far away from the people affected by them. Basically, aristocracy with worse branding. Were they right? Not completely. The United States did not instantly become an aristocratic dictatorship, but the tension they identified is still with us. Modern Americans argue constantly about political elites, lobbyists, donors, career politicians, bureaucrats, and whether the government actually represents ordinary people. Every time someone says, "Washington doesn't care about people like us," they are making an argument the Anti-Federalists would recognize, possibly while nodding smugly in powdered wigs. Of all the new offices created by the Constitution, the presidency may have made Anti-Federalists the most nervous. And you can understand why. Americans had just fought a war against monarchy. Then the Constitution proposed a single executive with command of the military, power to enforce laws, power to make appointments, power to issue pardons, power to negotiate treaties with Senate approval, and power to veto legislation. The Federalists said this was not a king. The president would be elected. His term would be limited. He could be impeached. His powers would be checked. Anti-Federalists were not reassured. They looked at the office and saw a king seed. Not a full-grown monarchy tree yet, but a little executive acorn that might one day become a giant royal pain in the ass. Writers like Cato warned that the president could become too powerful, especially if re-elected again and again. Others worried about the president's control over appointments, his connection to the Senate, his military command, and his ability to build influence. Now, George Washington helped calm some of these fears. He stepped down after 2 terms, setting a precedent against lifelong executive rule. But over time, the presidency grew. Andrew Jackson made it more populist and personal. Abraham Lincoln expanded executive power during the Civil War. Franklin Roosevelt transformed the presidency during the Great Depression and World War II. The Cold War expanded the president's role in foreign policy and national security. Modern presidents use executive orders, emergency declarations, administrative agencies, and military authority in ways the founding generation could barely have imagined. The Anti-Federalists feared an elected monarch. They did not specifically predict a president rage posting at 2 a.m. or people selling presidential bobbleheads at gas stations. But spiritually, they were in the neighborhood. The presidency became the most visible, powerful, personality-driven office in American politics. And every generation still argues, how much power should one person have? That is an anti-federalist question. If the Anti-Federalists were especially prophetic about one branch of government, it may have been the judiciary. Federal judges would hold office during good behavior, which effectively meant lifetime appointments. They would have protected salaries. They would interpret federal law. And because federal law was supreme, their decisions could override state courts and state laws. Brutus, one of the most important anti-federalist writers, warned that the federal judiciary would become enormously powerful. He argued that judges would be independent of the people and the legislature. They would interpret the Constitution, and when the Constitution's language was unclear, they would effectively shape its meaning. That is a pretty sharp prediction, because even though the Constitution did not explicitly say the Supreme Court gets to decide whether laws are unconstitutional, that power emerged later through judicial review, especially after Marbury versus Madison in 1803. Over time, the Supreme Court became one of the most powerful institutions in the country. It has shaped law on slavery, segregation, civil rights, abortion, guns, religion, campaign finance, presidential power, federal agencies, voting rights, and much more. Today, Supreme Court nominations are treated like apocalyptic cage matches because everyone understands what Brutus feared. Unelected judges can shape the country for generations. This is one of the strongest cases for the Anti-Federalists being right. They saw that the judiciary, though quiet and technical, could become a massive force in American life. The Supreme Court does not need an army. It has opinions. And apparently, that is enough to make everyone scream forever. Another major anti-federalist fear was the standing army. To modern ears, this might sound strange. Of course, a country has a military. That is what countries do. They have flags, borders, taxes, and at least one weird argument about national identity happening at all times. But in the 18th century, standing armies were deeply suspicious to many Republicans. History seemed full of examples where rulers used permanent armies to crush liberty. The memory of British troops stationed in the colonies was still fresh. The Quartering Acts, military enforcement, and occupation of Boston had helped fuel revolutionary anger. So when the Constitution gave Congress power to raise and support armies, Anti-Federalists worried. Would a standing army enforce federal laws against the people? Would it overpower state militias? Would it become a tool of tyranny? Federalists responded that national defense required national military power. The Articles had left the country weak. A republic needed the ability to defend itself. And again, both sides had a point. The Anti-Federalists underestimated how much military power the United States would eventually need, especially as the country expanded, fought wars, faced foreign threats, and became a global superpower. But they were right that military power would become deeply tied to federal authority. Today, the United States has a permanent military establishment, global bases, intelligence agencies, defense contractors, and a national security system so large it could probably lose $1 billion in a couch cushion. The Anti-Federalists feared a standing army. They probably did not imagine drones, aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, or budget hearings where everyone says readiness 16 times and then adds another few $1 billion. But their basic concern remains: can a free republic maintain massive military power without that power reshaping the republic itself? That question did not die. It just got a much larger budget. Taxation was another major battleground. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government could not directly tax. This was a disaster. Congress could ask states for money, but states often ignored the requests. The result was debt, weakness, and humiliation. Federalists argued that the new government needed real taxation power. Anti-Federalists understood the practical problem, but they feared the solution. If the federal government could tax individuals directly, it would have independent power. It would no longer depend on the states. It could fund armies, courts, officers, and enforcement. It could reach directly into the lives of citizens. And once a government can tax, it becomes real in a way speeches are not. Because nothing says sovereign authority like demanding money and threatening consequences if you say, "No thanks, I'm more of a barter guy." Were the Anti-Federalists wrong to fear federal taxation? Well, the United States needed taxation to survive. But taxation did become one of the central powers of the federal government. Today, federal taxes fund the military, Social Security, Medicare, infrastructure, agencies, courts, debt interest, and 1,000 programs most people only discover when they are either desperate or furious. Every April, Americans gather receipts, open tax software, mutter dark prayers, and attempt to satisfy the great paperwork beast. The Anti-Federalists feared federal taxation would become intrusive and powerful. And while they did not foresee TurboTax, asking if you bought a goat for business purposes, they understood the larger principle: power follows money. Now, this is where we need to be careful. The Anti-Federalists often defended state and local control as safeguards of liberty. And sometimes they were right. Local government can be more accountable. State governments can resist federal overreach. Communities can address their own needs better than distant officials. But local control is not automatically good. Sometimes local control protects liberty. Sometimes local control protects oppression. This is one of the biggest weaknesses in the Anti-Federalist worldview. Many Anti-Federalists talked about the people, but not everyone counted equally as the people. Women could not vote. Enslaved people were excluded from freedom entirely. Free Black Americans faced discrimination and political exclusion. Native nations were not treated as equal members of the political community. Property requirements limited participation in many places. And state power often protected these exclusions. Later in American history, Federal power would be essential in ending slavery, enforcing constitutional amendments, challenging segregation, protecting voting rights, regulating national markets, and defending civil liberties against abusive state governments. So, when Anti-Federalists warned that national power could threaten liberty, they were right. But when they implied that local power was naturally safer, they missed something important. A government close to home can still be cruel. Sometimes tyranny does not arrive from a distant capital. Sometimes it lives down the road, wins the county election, and knows exactly which families it wants to keep powerless. That is why the American system has always contained a brutal tension. National power can become dangerous. But national power can also be necessary to protect people from local injustice. The Anti-Federalists saw one side of the danger very clearly. They did not always see the other. So before we declare the Anti-Federalists magical prophecy goblins, let's be fair. The Federalists were right about many things. The Articles were too weak. The country needed the ability to tax. It needed to regulate trade. It needed an executive branch. It needed courts. It needed national defense. It needed to speak with credibility to foreign powers. A loose confederation of states might not have survived. The early United States faced debt, foreign pressure, internal rebellion, commercial chaos, and sectional conflict. The Federalists believed that without stronger union, the country could fracture. And they were probably right. The Constitution gave the United States enough structure to endure, expand, govern, and eventually become one of the most powerful nations in history. The Anti-Federalists were very good at spotting danger, but they were not always good at offering workable alternatives. Suspicion is useful, but suspicion alone cannot run a country. At some point, somebody has to collect taxes, enforce laws, settle disputes, and make sure the whole system does not collapse into 13 separate governments yelling at each other over tariffs and river access. The Federalists understood that liberty could be destroyed by tyranny, but it could also be destroyed by weakness, chaos, and disunion. So now we return to the question, were the Anti-Federalists right all along? The answer is, partly, and maybe more than Americans like to admit. They were right that federal power would expand. They were right that the presidency could become enormously powerful. They were right that federal courts would shape the nation. They were right that taxation would become a defining feature of national authority. They were right that standing military power could become permanent. They were right that distant elites would become a recurring problem. They were right that state authority would gradually lose ground. And they were absolutely right that a Bill of Rights was necessary. But they were not completely right. The Articles really were failing. The Constitution really did create a more stable government. A stronger union really was necessary. And federal power, for all its dangers, later became essential in confronting problems states either could not or would not solve. The Anti-Federalists warned that power could threaten liberty. The Federalists warned that weakness could destroy the Republic. American history proved both warnings true. And that is what makes the founding debate so fascinating. It was not a fight between geniuses and idiots. It was a fight between competing fears: fear of government being too weak, and fear of government becoming too strong, fear of disorder, and fear of domination, fear that the people would lose control, and fear that without a stronger union, there would be nothing left to control. The Constitution was not the end of that argument. It was the arena where that argument would continue, and it has continued ever since. Every fight over federal power, states' rights, executive authority, the Supreme Court, civil liberties, military force, taxation, local control, and elite rule is part of the same old struggle. The Anti-Federalists lost the ratification battle, but they never really left. They are there whenever Americans distrust Washington, whenever people demand rights in writing, whenever someone asks whether the president has too much power, whenever the Supreme Court hands down a decision that reshapes the country, whenever federal authority collides with local control, whenever citizens ask whether the government still answers to them. They lost, but they became part of America's permanent political conscience, because the United States was born from a contradiction. It needed power to survive, but it also feared power because of what power can become. The Federalists built the machine. The Anti-Federalists demanded warning labels. And more than 2 centuries later, we are still arguing over how dangerous that machine really is. So were the Anti-Federalists right all along? Not entirely. But they were right about one very important thing. A free people should never stop being suspicious of power, especially when power smiles, waves a flag, and says, "Trust me." Because history's answer to that has usually been, let's maybe write down some limits first, you suspicious powdered freak. Thanks for watching. If you find this interesting, please hit that like button. Subscribe for more historical content, and I will see you next time.